This is a level with everything in it. That's right, everything. From the max limit of blocks, to enemies, power-ups, tracks, arrows, and everything else. Except for icicles. Those things are horrible to work with. The reason this level even exists in the first place is because I wanted to see if it was possible to build a comprehensive level using the max course part limit for every object the level editor has to offer. If that made any sense. It really was just a test to see how far I could push Mario Maker's level editor. So just what kind of level did I build to begin with? Well, it should be pretty obvious at just a glance, but this whole level is a maze that you need to make your way through while avoiding spike tops, roys, and hunting optional red coins for a reward at the end. But wait, there's more! Because once you actually escape the maze, I added one final challenge which just consisted of jumping over multiple boom booms and one last roy to reach the end. And that's basically how the level was meant to play out. The concept of it is obviously nothing new or special, but actually adding everything in was the real hell. The two biggest objects I had to take care of were the ground blocks and block blocks. Block blocks, which I'll just refer to as any block that isn't just ground, have a max limit of 2,000 blocks. Yes, 2,000. And that might sound like a lot, but ground blocks need a total of 4,000 blocks. Twice as many as block blocks. It's funny, I made a YouTube short a while ago talking about how the max block limit was 9,999. Guess I just trolled 11,000 people for fun. Anyway, this is how I originally came up with the idea to go with the maze, because I could make a level that was 99% blocks with minimal open areas, but that was still enjoyable to an extent. Think of it as one of those ant colonies you had in your 6th grade science class. Except you're also an ant, being chased by other ants. Do ants eat each other? Okay, I'm going on a side tangent here. Essentially, I just used hard blocks as a decorative piece for the level by combining them with the ground blocks, which was a good way to use up a lot of the block limit, but wasn't nearly enough. There were just way too many blocks, so what I had to do was add in a ton of invisible blocks throughout the maze in hopes of reaching 2,000 blocks in the process. I didn't. So then I added donut blocks to the maze, very reluctantly so, may I add. I mean, we all understand how tedious it'll be playing through this level now, yes? Good. But guess what? It still wasn't enough. Let me tell you, the voices in my head started having a field day with this one. I started to believe at this point there was no way I could add enough blocks. That maybe the Mario Maker 2 wiki, shout out to the Mario Maker 2 wiki by the way, goated website, was somehow wrong and there were actually 9,999 blocks. I thought this was as far as my experiment would take me. That it was Jover. But nah, we're so Barack. Yes, I've been waiting to use that line forever. Sorry about that. Anyway, yeah, I did eventually reach the max block limit. So with the ground and block limits both having been reached, I actually began to think building a level like this was possible. I mean, not that I didn't think that before, but listen, some things can change a man for the worse. Quick intermission to say, I have a Discord channel. You should join it, because yes, link in description. End of intermission. Next, I turned my sights towards the enemy and gizmo entity limit, and fortunately for me, this one only required 100 objects to be placed down to fill up its limit. I had already added in a couple of spike tops throughout the maze, but it was really about 20% of the total objects I needed. And because I wanted the level to be balanced, adding in more enemies that would in turn make the level way too hard wasn't an option. And it's for that same reason that I didn't throw the rest of the enemies and gizmos I needed at the end of the level. Actually, I had to get a bit creative to make this work. Here's a fun fact. Adding objects like blocks to a track will subsequently make them count towards the enemy and gizmo entity limit. This was probably put in place to limit the amount of blocks you could put on a track, because who knows what would happen if you had 2,000 spawned in blocks moving in a level. But in the case of this level specifically, this is just what I needed. All I had to do was add in multiple rows of tracks at the start of the level, thank god they can overlap blocks, and put invisible blocks on said tracks to fill up the rest of the enemy and gizmo entity limit. You might call it a little cheap, but hey, I'm just using the tools at my disposal. Alright, so to give a little recap of where I was at, enemy and gizmo limit, reached. Block limit, reached. Ground limit, reached? Okay, so slopes. They are basically the same as ground, but aren't counted towards the ground limit, and you might be thinking, well yeah, it's a slope. It lets you slide down things and build up momentum and stuff, so that's probably why it's counted separately. Which would make sense, but that has nothing to do with it actually. It's because slopes are extendable objects. In fact, almost every object that can be resized is part of this one category, except for things like lift platforms, lava lifts, seesaws, things that have a couple more properties to them. Honestly, it was a huge relief to know that this was how it worked because I was a bit concerned as to how I was going to add 200 slopes into the level after that whole thing with the ground and block limits. But I didn't have to worry about that. One of the objects that are also part of this resizable terrain category are vines. They can be placed on essentially any block and it'll be fine since they're just layered behind said blocks. It's not like they just cease to exist or something. Now, while I could have just thrown a bunch of vines behind the blocks and called it a day, I did also want to use them as another decorative piece for the level, specifically the second half and beginning area. I know all you artists out there are super impressed by my insanely innovative and definitely never before seen use of vines. That said, it didn't end up being enough to max it out, so I figured I could add semi-solids in the maze, which would hopefully end up being enough. And it did! Well, I ensured that it did by intentionally going with 3 wide long semi-solids to fit in as many as possible. I couldn't make them overlap because you can only have up to 5 overlapping semi-solids before one begins to despawn when you place the 6, so it just created these weird small gaps in between that definitely didn't bother me. In fact, it didn't bother me so much that I later on ended up going back and changing the semi-solids one by one all over again to ones that look better, worse, because these just looked too good. Or something. That was believable, right? One of the things that I found myself scratching my head about were the bosses. And forget about Bowser and Bowser Jr. I'm talking about the Koopalings and Boom Boom, which required 7 of them to max them out, in the Koopalings case. It's already pretty uncommon to use all of these guys in a level without it being enemy spam or boss rush, but on top of it, this is a level with almost no space whatsoever. So I didn't even know if I could afford that. I was thinking of different solutions for about a good 10 minutes before I came up with the idea to incorporate the Koopalings into the maze. My thought process was that I could use Roy's ability to dig from one spot to another as a way of creating a threat that's always following you throughout the maze to create innovative gameplay where you constantly have to be aware of your surroundings in order to not die. But what actually ended up happening is he would dig into the ground once and just never come back up. He actually ceased to exist. But I did find it kind of funny how he never came back up, so I just kept him in anyway. Though I still wanted the Koopalings to play some part in the maze, so later on I ended up adding Mortons who would potentially stun and get you killed. Oh yeah, and the Boom Booms. Listen, I didn't even try anything special with them. I put 5 on munchers at the end of the level and called it a day. This was a pretty good time for me to knock out a couple easier things like red coins, which I scattered around the maze, doors, checkpoints, 1-ups which contributed slightly to the item entry limit, 10 coins, the angry sun, and snake blocks. Most of these were objects that had their own unique entity limit, and that was thankfully also a small limit at that. But this reprieve only lasted so long, because next, I had to add in tracks. Oh, and I'm not adding these in any particular order, I just didn't want to add them early on and then have to deal with removing them all the time to add in new things. But anyway, these guys have a limit of 1500. That puts it in 3rd place behind ground and blocks. But you want to know what's the difference between those guys and tracks? No? Well, too bad, you're learning anyway. For every 1 track you add into the level, you're using 3 blocks worth of space. Okay, well I guess that wasn't much learning. Point is, the amount of screen space these guys take up is very deceiving. 1500? That's a whole 500 less than blocks. But then you find yourself in the same situation as me, where you're just drawing and drawing and drawing, and oh my god, I'm getting flashback to using all those blocks from earlier. But this is somehow worse. I didn't even want to entertain the idea of trying something creative with these tracks either. Only thing going through my mind was, yep, let's just keep drawing. Any day now, it'll run out. Only good thing is I could turn off my brain the whole time and not have to worry. Next, arrows. There's 100 of them. So listen, I can add a couple of arrows to indicate where you're supposed to go, but that's pretty much the extent of it. So I won't even sugarcoat it. I just threw all of them behind the blocks and called it there. And I think that was actually about everything. Wait, no. How could I forget? Sound effects. You thought I was joking when I said everything. No, I meant everything. Except icicles. I first gave them to objects I knew needed sound effects, like red coins, 1-ups, checkpoints, 10 coins, and this spot right here for no reason in particular. Once I was content with that, I just added the rest to all the invisible blocks I mentioned earlier. And how many did I have to add in? 300. You all should be grateful I put them in these blocks instead of spamming them like a madman across the maze. It's also kind of interesting to think about the fact that the sound effects have a limit as well, because that didn't even cross my mind until looking on the wiki. But I mean, it does make sense, so But that is how this little experiment of mine came to be. Is this the only way you can make a level consisting of literally everything? Well, first of all, this level doesn't have everything. Again, icicles are big. And second, no. There's a lot of other ways you could make a level like this. For example, a music level, which already uses an insane amount of blocks and enemies to function. Or a speedrun level, similar to that of the new soup style ones we see so often. And yes, even refreshing levels. Sorry, I couldn't say that with a straight face. And those are just the ones I thought of. There's most definitely even more ways out there, but it was still pretty fun seeing what I could come up with. If you've watched my content before, you'll probably notice that this is pretty different from the type of videos I usually make, and probably not as well edited, at least not for my standards. There's just been a lot of things I've been having to deal with in my life that makes it really tough to make actually good videos and push them out consistently. I'm not too sure what's going to happen with my channel as time goes on, but I'm hoping that I can keep making content that I enjoy creating and that you guys enjoy watching. And I don't say this often, matter of fact, I don't think I've ever said this on video, but I am so grateful that you guys give me the ability to make these videos in the first place, because it obviously wouldn't be possible if nobody was watching in the first place. So, thank you. Now, go watch Smallin or something like that.